particular, there were increasing tensions that led to increased polarization, and that the causes of these tensions were again those problems of royal rule, and that is personality, royal finances, foreign policy, religion, and also dynastic succession. Now, if you remember at the end of the last lecture, we got to the 30 Years' War that broke out in 1618 over in Bohemia in the Holy Roman Empire. And if you remember, King James, his daughter had married the Elector of Palatine, Frederick V, and they were soundly defeated at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. So at this point, the foreign policy response from James and his court is going to be to try to funnel assistance to his son-in-law and daughter, and that is going to require acts of Parliament. Again, remember, Parliament being the political nation that in England had the sole authority to levy taxes. So that's going to set up a series of 5 parliaments in the 1620s, from 1621 to 1629. And 3 of these parliaments are in fact going to be dissolved as Parliament began to exercise, or at least attempt to exercise, greater influence in the formation of policies for the English nation. And of course, King James was pushing back against that parliamentary intrusion into what he considered his rightful and lawful area of governing. So that's where we're going to start. So we're going to start in the year 1621 with Parliament meeting to discuss money to support the Elector of Palatine, again the king's son-in-law. King James also wanted to arrange a dynastic marriage between the Stuarts and the Spanish Habsburgs in order to promote peace. And remember that they had been at war at the end of Elizabeth's reign, and there had been a peace declared at the Treaty of London in 1605, yet that left the English nation feeling somewhat suspicious about the motives of their king. And the king really wanted Parliament to stay out of this dynastic affair. And Parliament, however, responded to the king's critical attitude towards Parliament, saying that their ancient privilege of, and I quote, free speech, end quote, had been violated by the king. So this raises the specter now of free speech in Western society, I think, in a very dramatic way. We're going to see that continue to grow. So the Parliament wrote up a formal protest against King James and his actions, and then King James dissolved Parliament. So there's one of those 3 parliaments that's dissolved. Now, let me flip to here. In 1623, King James sent his son, Prince Charles, to Spain to meet the daughter of the Spanish king. And you see her pictured there, Ana Maria. And this mission, if you will, this sort of dynastic marriage mission, turned out to be a failure. So that the attempt by King James to promote peace through a marriage alliance with the Habsburg Spanish failed, and what James would then do is turn around and arrange a marriage of his son, Prince Charles, to the daughter of the assassinated King Henry IV of France. So if you don't succeed at first, the idea, I guess the motto is try again, and he succeeded in that. And we're going to then jump to 1624, and we're going to see that King James again needs money for his court and courtly activities, yet Parliament at this point has a condition that they attach to the request for new monies, and they say that they will not provide money until there's a declaration of war against Spain, and that also again involved the dynastic marriage between Charles and Henrietta of France to create a Franco alliance against the Spanish. So at this point, James is really faced with demands from Parliament. He needs money. The Parliament's making demands that he declare war against Spain. I guess the English nation had felt rejected, rebuffed by Spain, and continued to fear the presence of the Spanish Habsburgs. And there was always this, I guess, idea in the air, really, of conspiracy, that the Catholics, in particular the Habsburg Catholics, were always looking for ways to undermine and destabilize the English nation, roll back the Protestant Church there, and restore the Catholic faith to what the Habsburgs claimed to be its rightful place. So the English nation wants war with Spain. The English nation wants King James's son, Prince Charles, to marry the French princess, and then they'll vote for the funds that James needed. And that's exactly what happens. So what we see here, interestingly enough, and I think this goes back to the problem of royal power, who's in control? The king claims to be the divine right monarch representing God on earth to fulfill God's mission on earth, yet he has to go through Parliament to obtain the monies necessary to run his court and to carry out his policies. So that's the interesting question with regards to royal power that we've talked about. Now, we're going to see that King James dies in 1625, and his son, Prince Charles, comes to the throne as King Charles I. So there's no problem really here of royal succession in England. And Parliament in 1625, upon the accession of the new king, is going to vote monies to continue the war against Spain. Yet it denied King Charles what was then known as the customary funding for life to pay for court expenses and the upkeep and maintenance of the court. So Parliament in 1625 is going to give King Charles money for the war against Spain, but not money to fund his court. And I think this goes back to that question of personality. If you remember, I mentioned in the previous lecture that King James lived what we might call the good life, the princely life, the charmed life, and that began to irritate members of Parliament who were of the merchant class, who were thrifty, hardworking, believed in saving, and they were also Protestant, and the Calvinist ideas of Protestantism preached a life of restraint, a more ascetic life, and James seemed to violate all those things. So it seems clear to me that Parliament in 1625 wants war as a nation, but doesn't want to have a libertine king, that is, a king who indulges in the excesses of life at the court. And this is going to, again, create conflict between the king, the new King Charles, and Parliament. And what that's going to do is also force Charles to have to find monies in other ways other than the legal taxes through parliaments, and that's called extra legal taxation, and that's something that he's going to do. Now there's another problem that comes up, and it again is a problem of personality, I think, in large part, and that is one of the great nobles of the English nation, the Duke of Buckingham. And King James had favored and lavished great praise and titles and lands on the Duke of Buckingham, and we know that King James seemed to enjoy the company of young men, and certainly Buckingham fit that category. And I think I might have a picture of him. I do right here. So rather comely looking Duke of Buckingham. And King Charles is going to use the Duke of Buckingham to send a naval expedition to attack the Spanish at the port town of Cadiz. And this is going to end in a terrible fiasco and humiliating defeat. And it was really the incompetence of the Duke of Buckingham that led to this military defeat. Yet King Charles, like his father before him, stood by Buckingham, and Buckingham becomes one of the king's leading advisors in his court, and that's going to cause problems, again, with Parliament. So again, I think the problem of personality and who surrounds the king here is going to be important. So in 1626, Parliament meets again, and they provide, again, monies to continue the war with Spain, but this time Parliament attached the condition that the king and his court had to hear grievances put forth by Parliament. And these grievances that Parliament was putting together, drawing up, were primarily aimed at Buckingham, the Duke of Buckingham. And they actually drew up what were known as articles of impeachment against Buckingham. Now, King Charles reacted very negatively to this, and he tried to have leaders of Parliament arrested. And this attempt failed. In other words, the parliamentary leaders had heard about this attempt, and they had fled Parliament. So then King Charles did what his father, King James, had done. You're unhappy with Parliament? Dissolve it, send it home. And at that point, in 1626, Charles and Buckingham claim national emergency status, and they levy a special tax to raise money to fund the war with Spain. And this tax was known by the name of a forced loan. And that is that the king would send out his officials to the great families and to the merchant families across England and simply demand payment, demand a loan to the king. And if the person refused, they would then be arrested. So this was known as the forced loan, and of course it is not legal, it is extra legal. 70 members of the English gentry, in fact, refused to pay this forced loan tax, and they were imprisoned without trial. And that's also going to be a violation of English custom and sort of constitutional practice. That is, dating back to the Middle Ages, there was the idea that in the English system of justice, though the king's justice, there was still a trial by jury of peers, and this precedent was being completely overlooked. Now, what we see is that Parliament is going to have to come back into session at some point, and the King, Charles, and Buckingham are going to continue their war against Spain, but they're also now going to expand this war effort against France, as the French Catholics under Louis XIII began to harass the Protestants in France. Edict of Nantes notwithstanding. So the English are going to attack the French at New Rochelle to help their Protestant brothers. And this expedition also ended in military disaster. And it's at this point that Parliament is going to begin to respond rather forcefully to the actions, policies of the king and his close advisor, Buckingham. So in 1628 rather, in 1629, Parliament is again in session because Charles needs money now to fight the wars against the Spanish and the French. But there's an angry mood in Parliament. And I think you can understand that now, again, problems of personality, problems of royal rule, problems of finance, and problems of foreign policy, in addition to problems of religion, are all going to come together and form the perfect storm. And this is going to lead to the open conflict that is going to emerge. So the House of Commons promised to vote the king a large sum of money in 1628, but they insisted again that their grievances be heard before any monies were actually paid to the crown. In this time, Parliament drew up a list of grievances that formally articulated their position, and it was known as the Petition of Right. And I think, oh, I forgot about that. There's the tax crisis there. Sometimes I forget these slides that I have. You can see the prison cells, so 70 of the great gentry are arrested. Now I want to get to the Petition of Right, 1628, and this is a rather important document in the history of England, in its constitutional history, but also for the United States and other Western democracies in subsequent centuries. So the basic rights that Parliament presents in this petition are no taxation without consent, no arbitrary arrests, no billeting of troops without consent, and no government by martial law. And I think you can see some of the things you'll see later in the American Revolution, that idea that James Otis put forth in 1765 of no taxation without consent and no arbitrary arrests. So in order to get the money from Parliament, King Charles actually agrees to the Petition of Right, though he did insist that he did not surrender any of his God-given powers. Now, at this point, the Duke of Buckingham is assassinated, something we've heard of frequently at this time in early modern history. In August 1628, the Duke of Buckingham was assassinated, and this causes universal rejoicing in Parliament. King Charles, however, is very upset and bitter at the murder of his friend. Now, in 1629, Parliament is in session once again, and Parliament attempted to press its advantage against the Crown, having already obtained the Petition of Right, and King Charles had agreed to it. And this time, in 1629, we're going to turn to the problem of religion, and Parliament launches an attack on the bishops of the Church of England, who had attempted to reintroduce Catholic elements into English churches. And when we talk about Catholic elements, we're talking about adornments of the church, so crosses on the altars, elaborate candlesticks, the priest wearing certain clothing that would distinguish and elevate the priest or minister, and the actual prayer service. So the bishops, and again remember the English church is really modeled on the Roman Catholic Church in terms of its hierarchical organization, that is, the structure of the church. So these bishops are trying to reintroduce some Catholic elements, and that was something that King Charles felt deeply about. He deeply felt that he wanted to have the English church really modeled more along the lines of the Catholic Church. And King Charles was really trying to, I think, use religion as a way to drive uniformity and to get people to submit to his will and his idea of how things ought to be. And King Charles, unlike his father King James, was not that pragmatic. It seems that King James was a little bit more pragmatic, knew when to push and when not to push. King Charles doesn't, and he's going to insist that people follow his lead and the lead of his bishops. This is going to really cause a great reaction in Parliament. There was also, in 1629, an attack by Parliament on the Crown for its illegal taxation, that is, taxation without consent that had been granted in the Petition of Right. And at this point, Charles does what they most often do. He wants to dissolve Parliament. But members of Parliament really kind of prevented the king's royal official who had come to announce the dissolution of Parliament, and they grabbed him, they held him down, so he wasn't able to announce the actual dissolution of Parliament, which prevented him from making that announcement, and Parliament kind of shut their doors then against the king and the troops. And it's at this point that Parliament, in the House of Commons in particular, led by John Eliot, put forward 3 resolutions. I'll get to those 3 resolutions, and you can see there John Eliot. Number 1, anyone furthering popery was a capital enemy of England. So the crime would be punishable by death. And that is a direct attack at the bishops that Charles had ordered to reintroduce those elements of the Catholic Church in the English Church. And that's going to then go back to the problem of religion. So number 2, whoever advised the king to collect tax revenue without the consent of Parliament would be declared a capital enemy of England. And number 3, anyone paying said unauthorized taxes was an enemy to the liberties of England. And so here we see another word. We had previously encountered the word free speech. Here we see the idea of the liberties of England. And it's increasingly going to be a question of who defends the liberties of England, the court and the monarch, Parliament and the political nation, and that's going to be a big question going forward. So these 3 resolutions were passed by Parliament, and then Charles actually does manage to dissolve Parliament in 1629, and Parliament would not meet again for 11 years. So there's this 11-year period from 1629 to 1640 where there's no Parliament. Now, I think then we have to stop and pause. What do we make of all these events of the 1620s? And I think there's several big questions that emerge from that. And those questions are, were the king's powers limited by the political nation? What was the scope of Parliament's role in advising the king on matters concerning the English nation? And what was the role of Parliament in determining ecclesiastical questions? So we're going to see that Parliament has tried to push its way into not only advising the king, but demanding certain policies of the king. The king is trying to protect and defend his God-given right to rule as a sovereign, yet the question of sovereignty itself is somewhat confusing, and that confusion really is going to take us into the 1630s, a decade which I'm going to call a time of troubles. And we're going to see then that these three questions go somewhat unanswered. That is, there aren't clear answers, and there's going to be a back and forth, if you will, tug of war, maybe the best way to kind of think about this, between the crown and the political nation. And at the end, that's going to erupt into a civil war. And you should be somewhat familiar with that in terms of your knowledge of American history. In the 1850s, we have a very violent decade in the United States as factions in the North and the South are struggling in a tug of war over control of the government and over the question of slavery. So here, I think we have a struggle and a tug of war over who gets to set policy in terms of foreign policy, in terms of religious policy, in terms of tax policy. So these big questions that we see are going to really kind of erupt in the 1630s. And I have that listed up there on the screen for you, the problems of taxes, religious troubles, that actually leads to a bishop's war that we'll talk about. So at this point, let's stop this lecture, and if you have any questions, please jot them down, and we'll take them up in class. Thanks.